Okay, everybody, welcome. My name is David Kramer, and I am director of the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Thank you for joining us. Let me begin with just a couple of technical matters. Please keep yourselves on mute, but don't worry if you stray off of mute, because I will find you and I will remute you to make sure that there are no background noises that get in the way of everybody's hearing properly. And there will be time for questions toward the end, but let me ask you, rather than waiting, we'll do that through chat, I guess is the best way to say it. I will take the questions, mark them down, and convey them to Letty at the appropriate time. So if you'd like to put them in chat while you're listening, please do. If you want to save them for the end, that's fine. The only thing I would ask is that you not use chat for ongoing chatting, only because when that pops up on the screen, it can be distracting to the speaker. So again, I'm David Kramer, and we at the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary have the pleasure and privilege of sponsoring book talks throughout the year that are dedicated to books of Jewish interest, significant books of Jewish interest, and there is no doubt that this is one such book. I want to thank my friend Letty Cottin Pogrebin for agreeing to join us. She and I have been friends for a long time, and I actually had the privilege of reading this book in its pre-final stage. So I confess I didn't go back to check the version I read against the final published version, but I assume it's close enough. In any case, Shanda is really a wonderful book that combines a variety of very important perspectives. It is, to begin with, personal in the best way, where when one speaks of one's own experiences in life, that can be used instructively, and there is a great deal of instruction in this book. But I would add that Letty is a very knowledgeable Jew, and as she reflects on the meanings of her own experience, she also draws upon the depth of Jewish tradition to add to the instruction that the personal stories would bear in any case, but adding the level of Jewish instruction to this really makes it a remarkable combination. So that's what we're here for, and we're going to do it in the space of an hour. Letty, I want to begin just by giving you the opportunity to say hi, to say any words of introduction you'd like to say, and then if you want to just begin by telling people what they can expect to see in the book.
Yes. I want to begin by thanking you, David, for something like 25 or maybe 30 years of your wisdom. Studying with you has made my life so much richer. And in keeping with your very kind statement that I'm Jewishly educated, I will say, I think Pirkei Avot says it all: make yourself a teacher, find yourself a friend. And that's exactly what happened between you and me. So going forward and into the, as they say now, every time you turn around, let's dive deep into the subject. Shonda is really a particular kind of memoir because it isn't just chronological, it's thematic. I discovered as I was writing that almost every anecdote, almost every issue that I was raising had something to do with shame or secrecy. And, writers psychoanalyze themselves on the screen on the keyboard. And so I just reread my own words and I said, my whole family is riddled with shame. I was steeped in shame. The Shanda was at my dinner table, the dinner tables of my childhood. And the Shanda and secrecy is woven into the texts of my tradition. one day, as I write in the book, one day I was sitting in synagogue. I'm a member of BJ for B'nai Jeshurun, for any of you who are my shul mates. And I was listening to the parsha on Jacob marrying who he thought was Rachel and discovering under the veil that he had married Leah, and masking and cover-ups and hiding. Hester Panim, God hides God's self from Moses. How thoroughly enmeshed the whole issue of secrecy is in our tradition, in a way that ends up being instructive. It ends up saying sometimes you have to lie. It ends up saying sometimes for the greater good, you have to construct a different reality. You have to fake it. You have to put skins on your kid's arms so that his father gives the blessing to the right person. And in my life, as you know, there are 52 very short chapters in Shanda, but one of them tells the kind of original sin in my household, and that is that my parents constructed a Potemkin village of a life for themselves. They pretended they were married years before they were married. They pretended they had just 2 children and that my sister and I were sisters, and it turned out otherwise. So without diving too deep on the first shoot off the diving board, I'll say that that's pretty much what people are in for if they open this book.
Okay, so I mean, you went to it quickly. I mean, the personal story, of course, and I'm sure that given what you've already said, there are those who will be a little bit more curious about the details. So please feel free to add that as you like. But you also touch on the fact that Shandas, are those things that we don't speak about, or we shouldn't speak about. They're often kept secret. So is that an essential connection? You also note, I mean, the word Shanda obviously is a Jewish word, a Yiddish word. Is there something Jewish about this kind of secrecy, do you think? Or at least did you experience it that way? Maybe that's a better way to ask it.
I experienced it that way, but I also don't claim to express the Shandas of other cultural traditions. I know that shame and secrecy are not unique to Jews, but there is a unique form of shame and secrecy in Judaism. And I think my deconstruction of it has to do with the fact that I was raised in an immigrant family, that my parents both came over in poverty, my mother worse than my father's. My mother was ashamed of everything, the life that she lived as a child. She and her family came from a little shtetl in Hungary called Pilipitz. I always ask my audiences, is there anyone from Pilipitz? Like they do on comedy shows. Who's from St. Albans? Actually, nobody's ever raised his or her hand, but she writes about living in a very modest cottage on a dirt street, across the street from a church and next to a bridge over a stream. That's all I know. But when she got here, she was wearing cardboard shoes. There's a picture of her in her clothing, and her family lived in the classic tenement. If you've ever been to the Lower East Side Tenement Museum or seen Hester Street, you can imagine that kind of childhood. And so she had to create a false biography for herself in order to present herself in the world. She, like many immigrants, and like every immigrant in my family, wanted to be real Americans. So they wanted to get rid of their accent, and they wanted to present a very idealized face to the Gentile world. You didn't want a Shanda for the Goyim. You didn't want Gentiles to see your feet of clay, your flaws, your weaknesses, any of the ugliness. So what was covered up in my family were unhappy marriages, mental illness, any kind of illness, definitely the C word that was whispered, only in whispers. Homosexuality, of course, any alternate sexuality, financial problems, that was that was bad, poverty, obviously, but even if you were doing well, what seemed to be well, and there were problems in that picture, you had to shroud them in a surface that suggested otherwise. I kind of ended up admiring my family after all the stories were down on the page, because I saw that, again, what I said earlier about the Torah stories that I grew up on, that I saw there was a greater purpose, that they were trying to fit in, that they felt they had to do these things, they had to change their names, and they had to hide certain things. Hiding is very Jewish. So again, when you say what is particularly Jewish about all of this, we hide. That's how we survived. Whether we're hiding behind a false cabinet, or we're hiding behind a false passport, or we're hiding in the woods. Or during the Inquisition, we actually change who we seem to be by hiding whatever Jewishness is left of us behind a Christian identity. So it all fell into place for me. Of course, I've spent many years in Black Jewish dialogue and Palestinian Jewish dialogue, and I've gotten to know my friends of those identities very, very well and very personally. So I know they have their own. I know that, whatever shame we have in our community, that I know somebody who found out her father was her priest, not her father. I mean, and that's a pretty big Shanda, that may not go by a Yiddish word.
That's for sure. Well, so you talk about hiding as a kind of Jewish strategy, and you made mention of a couple of historical settings in which it was a very important strategy for survival. I wonder, I mean, since very recently we read and celebrated the story that is embedded in the Scroll of Esther, whether we have some reflection. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Whose name means hidden, doesn't it?
Whose name, yes, whose name can be taken for hidden. I mean, the name Esther actually has ironically two meanings, both of which suggest hidden for our purpose, one of which is precisely what you say, that it's played on in rabbinic midrash, Esther related to hastir, to hide, right? She hid her identity, and that was definitely the case, obviously, in the story, but also ironically, her name comes from the Persian Ishtar. Right, that's a good way to hide, right? Adopt a name that has nothing to do with your own culture. Let it be part of the large adjacent culture. And you already began to speak about that in connection to your family. So I wonder, I mean, do you personally learn something from Esther and that model? I'm now offering you the opportunity to teach us about, Esther and Purim. But I'm also curious whether you think, since you mentioned hiding as a strategy for survival, when is hiding a good thing and when is hiding a bad thing? Because near the end of your book, you actually wish folks that they should have a secret-free life, which, so I don't know, why don't you pick that up and play with it for a while?
Yeah, first I have to say about Esther that I, like probably every female on this call, on this Zoom, played Esther at various points in my childhood. When I became a feminist, I realized I should have played Vashti. Vashti, who said, no, I'm not doing that, But moving on from Esther, now I have to move on and remember what you asked me.
Well, I mean, the center of it was whether hiding, can be good, or is it only, only a bad thing? Again, in light of your final prayer or blessing for folks reading the book.
Right. I must say that I'm turning 84 very soon, and so I used to be able to say, and I want to discuss, and I'm going to discuss three things, and then of course I couldn't remember after I invade on the first. I couldn't remember the second or third. Now that's my problem. Thank you. I think hiding is a bad thing, and this is a flat-footed answer, but it's true. I think hiding is a bad thing when it hurts you. I think hiding that becomes a burden is a bad thing. I think hiding that allows you to accomplish the larger goal and doesn't hurt anybody else is an okay thing. I keep the secrets other people tell me, but I've gotten rid of all of mine. And it makes me feel very light. It makes me feel free. It makes me feel liberated. And it also allowed me to discover how many people are hiding the same stuff I thought was so shameful. And as soon as you recognize you have a commonality with a lot of people over something you thought was awful, it gets less awful. And you get the bonus of sort of sympathetic, empathetic collectivity, solidarity, you know.
Mhm.
Here we are, all people, I say at times in a room, I say, here we are, all people who thought we were the only ones whose parents lied to us, you know, and our parents lied to us in terrible, terrible ways that we've now had to deconstruct and pull apart so we can understand who we are and why we do what we do. And why should we have to, you know, pay God knows how much money to sit on a couch and discover that all of our mishigas and began with our parents lying to us? So there is a kind of comfort in discovering that Shandas aren't so bad and that they're part of life, or in fact, they are life. They are life in many people's experience. I do say I want the readers of this book to end up being motivated to have a secret-free life, but not a shame-free life. I am, and I will say it flatly, ashamed, full of shame of Israel. I do not want to lose my capacity for shame about what's happening in Israel. I don't want to lose my capacity for shame when people don't pick up litter, dog litter. I want to continue to be ashamed of such people and such behavior. So it's
Whoops, somebody strayed off of, let me find them and mute them. Okay, go ahead.
But I always like to hear laughter. So
Yeah, laughter is always good. I agree. Okay, I'm sorry. So you were interrupted by the laugh. Was there more that you wanted to say there?
No. I just want to underscore the distinction between shame-free and secret-free. Secret-free is pretty much always good, and shame-free is not.
Got it. Okay, well, that's very important distinction. Thank you for that. You also distinguish, I think we would all distinguish between kind of personal or semi-personal Shondas and collective Shondas. So, I mean, you made mention before of it's a Shonda for the Goyim, you know, I mean, what Jews might do and the way it would be perceived by others. How do you feel about that distinction? And particularly, how do you feel about Jews being ashamed by the actions of other Jews? You actually touched on it now in your reference to Israel, but I suspect there's more there to explore.
Yeah, I don't have to go very far into the past to say that no Jew I know was not ashamed of Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein. You know, we were deeply disturbed as a community by the number of Jews proportionally in the Me Too exposures. What did we as parents or a culture do that allowed these men to think they could exercise power in this way over people who were less powerful? And I think that's not very different from the question of Israel and Palestine. When we were promised that we would be a light unto the nations, I don't think God had this in mind. Treatment of others. So that's one thing. I think, you know, that our tradition, or at least the lesson I've taken from it, is that lahavdil, to separate, to distinguish, is what makes us human. You know, it's what makes us smart humans. that we distinguish between light and dark, between holy and profane, and also between really good shame and really bad shame. Okay. And for me to criticize the government of the state of Israel is not for me to criticize Israelis, the land of Israel, the Jewish people. It's for me to criticize particular behavior that I believe is ferociously un-Jewish. And I have braved the brickbats of the people who would say you're a self-hating Jew and you're an enemy of the people, because I will not give up on what I learned in my Hebrew school, my synagogue, the sanctuaries of my synagogue, and my home. The values that I learned in my home forced me to criticize the government of Israel. And I have done so now for way too many years, which makes me extremely sad. So I stand by that. I think that I am upholding the precepts, the ethos, the decency that I was taught as a child.
Okay, and let me ask you, since I actually have a different response to some of the examples you offered, I know you well enough to know that you don't actually believe in Jewish exceptionalism, though you have great pride in things that Jews have done. And I think that affects the way you think about your relationship to Jews in the world. So if you don't actually believe in Jewish exceptionalism, then why isn't the bad things that Jews do just humans acting badly?
Because I don't believe in Jewish exceptionalism because I know better now, but I was raised on it. It was mother's milk to me. Therefore, it informs my values. And I still say, how could a Jew do this? I know you've been teaching us, David, for 25 years that Jews do this. You have that Jews do this. And you have also shown us that the things I thought were so exceptional about my tradition and what I was taught were taught to others in their tradition. I understand all that. But since I imbibed this at such an early age and in such heavy doses, it informs the absolutism of my values. And my values keep telling me, how can a Jew do this? If you were paying attention to what you were taught, even though other people were taught the same good stuff, how can you do this?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's left of my Jewish exceptionalism. Although I know that other people were raised just as I hope, with just as good precepts. And I know this from working shoulder to shoulder with people of every possible background on the values that I consider Jewish. There you go.
Yeah. You don't need to respond to this, but I just want to share, since you just spoke a little bit more about your relationship as a critic of Israel. I'm reading now David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass. And last night I came across a quote from an 1847 speech of Douglass's that I underlined because it struck me as so relevant to actually what you just said, though unwittingly. Douglass commented, "He is the lover of his country who rebukes and does not excuse its sins." I wouldn't be surprised if you've heard that before.
I have heard hocheach tochiach, if that's what you're referring to.
Yes, right. Okay, good. So make the connection for those who aren't familiar with what you just said.
Well, we are obliged to rebuke wrongdoing. And when we see it, because otherwise we're sort of a party to it. So for me, the struggle, and I know we've discussed this before, David, has been how do you balance on the tightrope that starts with hocheach tochiach and ends with lashon hara. And you balance lashon hara being evil, the evil tongue or gossip. So if I have to rebuke someone, am I going to shame them on the grounds of the evil tongue? And I don't know the rabbinic literature well enough to know, but I'm sure that they have engaged that issue
at great length and in detail, for sure.
So again, the Torah is like who was the one, Ben, who said, turn it.
Turn it. Right, exactly.
Everything is in it. Everything is in it.
Right.
So we can find the wisdom we need, but some people cherry pick it. That's the problem.
Yep. Yep. Okay. So if you don't mind, I'd like to, because I think that listeners would be interested, go to a little bit more of the personal stuff. First, your personal history. Um, so you describe in the book your grandmother, who was a runaway bride, which became a huge Shanda for her family, scandal in the larger community. Can you tell us a little bit?
Do people know what a runaway bride is?
Go ahead and make sure that they do, please.
So my grandmother in Philippines was betrothed to a guy, and I say in the book, I equate him with Razorwolf the Butcher, because he was older than her. It was a completely inappropriate match, but that's who she was betrothed to, because he had some means and my grandmother's family did not. And my grandmother, on her wedding night, after the ceremony, when she was in the bridal chamber, which I gather was one floor up in whatever it was, an inn or somebody's home or what. And she was in the bridal chamber, and her supposed husband had gone to take off his clothes. She tied together the bed sheets and she jumped out the window and she ran away to the man who became my grandfather. So I have consulted both David and another very close, very solidly educated rabbi friend of mine, and I have discovered that my grandmother was truly not married, which is what she claimed, and given all the halachic reasons why that wasn't in fact a kosher marriage. But my grandparents didn't know that, so they thought that they might have been defamed by people in Philippines, and so when they came to America, they never told anybody that my grandmother had been a runaway bride. They were married by a rabbi in Poland, so he must have known that it was an okay thing to marry them. But it was the Shanda, it was what original sin of our family was, that Shanda. That's what set the stage for Secrecy, I think, for the next 100 and something years, because they got married in the 1890s. That was the first. But then, well, I'll say I was raised by an immigrant mother, as I've said, with an 8th grade education. And my father his mother was pregnant on the boat. So when they settled in New Haven, she gave birth to him, and he had called himself throughout his life a Connecticut Yankee. Okay. He claimed he was a real American. Of course, he was born here, but in the same kind of family that my mother was raised in. And he treated her as a greenhorn. It was a very convenient thing for a man with a large ego to have a wife who had an 8th grade education. He could always sort of shame her and make a joke of it, like, who was Attila the Hun or something, and she would know nothing about that. But my father, each of my parents gave me some wonderful legacies that were unique to them. My father made me an intellectual, such as I am, because the only thing that you could do to keep him at the table was to get involved, either talking about his legal cases or talking about a Talmudic tractate or something. My father had no emotion, no sentimentality. He was a lawyer, unusual for that time. My father was born in 1900. He graduated from City College in 1920 and NYU Law School in 1923. Very unusual for the times and for what he came from. He was a Hebrew teacher. He was a bar mitzvah tutor of many boys. That's how he paid his way through college and law school. So I got all that from him. He's the one who made sure I was educated like a boy, because he didn't have sons. And so I went to Hebrew school and Hebrew high school at our synagogue, and I went to the yeshiva of Central Queens for 2 years, and my father tutored me for my bat mitzvah, and I had to learn everything from scratch. I could not do transliteration or anything. I had to learn the whole thing the right way. So I owe him that. I also owe my father his commitment to Jewish life. My father was a macher. When we moved to Queens, he was the president of the Jamaica Jewish Center and the local ZOA, and he was county commander of the Jewish War Veterans. And he was, the president of the Men's Club. If he was an organization in Jewish life in Queens, he was the head of it at some point. Jack Cotton was his name. My mother was a balabuster, a warm, loving, let me say, talk about Lahavdil. He was a Litvak and she was a Glitziana. So that's the first, the first division, the first separation that we can name. And it showed in their personalities. Litvaks are like Spock on Star Trek, and Glitzianas are like Fran Drescher. And my mother was warm and gemuchlik, and she made a beautiful Shabbat table and beautiful holidays, and she decorated the house. And she was superstitious, and I got all her stuff too. I will not, I had to chew a thread when my mother was mending something on me, because she believed the only thing you should be sewn into is your shroud. And so you had to chew this thread so that the ayin hara, the evil eye, would know that you were alive and you were not entering that realm. A whole lot of other things I grew up with. I was slapped when I first menstruated. Why? Because my mother said, she had said something in Yiddish. I wasn't allowed to learn Yiddish. No, Yiddish, I was a real American, so I couldn't learn Yiddish. That was the secret language. That's another secret. It was the secret language. But I said, what? I never got hit. Why did you slap my face? She said, I just asked God to make sure that slap is the worst thing that ever happened to you. Believe me, it hasn't been. But she had her heart in the right place. So I was raised with all of her superstitions and all of her concern for beautifying Jewish tradition and ritual. And my mother couldn't read Hebrew. She had to go for adult education to learn to read Hebrew and understand the prayers. And she did. She was an autodidact of the first order. But it came with so much shame. She faked, because she only graduated from the 8th grade. My mother faked a high school graduation picture so she could put it on the shelf. When she had to leave school to work in a sewing machine factory, she saved enough money to go to a photo studio and do what we can now do on whatever that photo fix thing is. What's that called, David?
Photoshop.
Photoshop. Yeah, what you could do with Photoshop, she did in a photo studio. She went to the prop box. She got a chignon she attached to her head, and I don't know, some earrings and a rolled up diploma that she sat with a bunch of silk roses, as if it was a graduation picture. So I inherited my father's, scholarship and intellectual curiosity, and my mother's warmth and need to be perfect. I'm, cursed with the need to be perfect, which of course you can never be. But the table has to be perfect and everything has to be perfect. And you make a good try at it. And her superstitions. So that's basically my background.
Okay. When one goes looking into one's background, or when another goes looking into one's background, you never know what you're going to discover. So your granddaughter, in pursuit of a college assignment, she made a discovery, didn't she, of letters? Tell us something about that.
Yes. My granddaughter, Molly, my daughter, Abigail's daughter, had when she was in college, she took a course on biography, and the professor assigned the course to write a biography of 50 pages of somebody who's alive. So my granddaughter, Molly, chose me. And this was funny. And I'll be self-deprecating in this because I thought it was hilarious. She told her Yale professor that she wanted to write a biography of her grandmother, and he practically laughed in her face, which tells you of the stereotypes that Yale professors have of Jewish grandmothers. So my granddaughter Molly, showed him the Googled me, and he looked at it and he said, "Okay, you can do that." And I wasn't insulted because, quite frankly, I had to Google him. He was a military historian, a biographer of statesmen, and I had never heard of him. So there. It's unfair to ask a guy like that to know who was on the masthead of Ms. Magazine, and it's hard to ask someone like me to know who's a military historian. I was not insulted. Anyway, so she's doing all her research. She goes up to my archive. She reads or rereads all my books. She's an incredible scholar, and articles, and she interviews everybody in my life. She finds people I didn't know were alive to interview. And I gave her phone numbers that are so old they didn't have area codes on them. But she did all the work. And then she comes to my study here. and I mean, I've got, books up the kazoo and shelves and onward. And she says, "Where are the things from your childhood?" And I said, "Oh, down there. Down there, there's a very deep cabinet. I just keep throwing things into it. It's really a deep cabinet." And she bends down and I bend down, and she pulls out my teenage diary that was locked with a key, as if the CIA needed to get into my diary at 12. And then I pull out a plastic shopping bag the size of if you ever knew Orbex, it's like Macy's, only discount. You could put a large Persian lamb coat in this plastic shopping bag, which everyone in my family had a Persian lamb coat in the 1950s. So that's where it probably came from. And it was full of letters, hundreds of letters, in the onion skin paper, and stamps for 3 cents or 1 cent. And make a long story short, my husband always says at this point in my peroration that it's too late for that. But to make a long story short, it was the letters between my parents and documents from my family and certificates and, Israel bonds and everything you could think of was in that shopping bag. And I upended it on a very large dining room table that we have, that seats 12, and it filled the table. And I just started plowing through them. And I discovered my parents' marriage, and I discovered their secrets. I discovered that my mother lied about her age 3 times, 3 different ways. She was born in 1901, 1902, and 1905 on different documents.
Wow.
I discovered my father's divorce papers. By this time, of course, I knew that they had each been divorced before, but that was their original Shonda. Mm-hmm. To have been divorced in the 1920s in the Jewish world, got to be covered up, got to be hidden, got to be buried. And those were their lies.
Why do you think they kept the letters? Do you think they figured no one would find them, or?
Well, the letters were given to, the shopping bag was given to me by my sister Betty, who it turns out I thought was my sister, who just happened to be 14 years older than myself. Turns out she was 14 years older because she was the child of a different husband. And my parents had lied and said that, my father and mother were married in 1923. Anyway, when my mother died in 1955, I was 15 and my sister was 14 years older. So she was 29, and she found the letters in my mother's closet. She then added, I guess it was a smaller pile in there. She then added all my letters to her during the 4 years at Brandeis, and a lot of other documents that she felt I would want to inherit. And when I went up to her assisted living place the last time, I knew she was dying because she controlled her own dying. She did it by starvation, and then she stopped drinking. And so then we knew it was just a matter of days. And I was with her, I knew, for the last time. She pointed to this thing that was leaning against the door so I wouldn't forget it. It was this shopping bag. And she said, "I found this in Mommy's closet, and someday you'll want to read them." Well, she was in Newton, Massachusetts. And when I got on the Acela to go home that night, I could not read a thing. I was weeping. I knew I would never see my sister again. So I just held it on my lap. When I got home, I couldn't, it was midnight. I couldn't stand the idea of reading these. And so I shoved them in this closet. And 2 days later, my sister died, and I never looked at them again until Molly said, where's your childhood? And then I pulled out my childhood. There it was.
Wow, that's extraordinary. Really amazing. Now, I don't want to ask you to get too personal, but this is up to you. And since you wrote about it, you may be willing to share. You spoke about secrets that you yourself had from Brandeis. Do you want to say anything about that?
Of course. How can I not expose a secret that's in a book? Yeah. Well, I had written about my abortion when I was a senior at Brandeis in the New York Times in 1990. I don't remember what, 5, 6, 7, 8, something. Because I was really upset that abortion, though legal, was not being discussed. It had still been stigmatized. And I didn't feel we could create a movement without solidarity, as I said earlier in this discussion, and that women needed to be able to talk about their abortions. And that I knew everybody I knew either knew someone or had had one, or someone in their family had one. And why were we still treating it as if it were a secret and shaming ourselves by doing that? So I wrote the first piece in the New York Times ever about that a woman admitted having had an abortion, and that was it. And then I'm writing this book, and I'm facing my conscience, and I realized that I have hidden something, that I had 2 abortions in my senior year. And I interrogate myself, as you do as a writer, when you've seen when you write, I write to find out what I think. A lot of people have said some version of that, but I really do write to find out why I do what I do and what I think. And here I see, as I'm writing Shonda, and I have written about abortion, why didn't I write about the 2 of them? And I realized I didn't write about the 2 of them because part of Jewish exceptionalism, as I was raised, is that Jews are smart. And it really was a very dumb thing I did, to get pregnant twice. How could I admit that as a Jewish girl? How could I admit to the world that I got pregnant twice with the same guy, the same semester, which was my senior year before? And I would have been pregnant by graduation. I mean, my second abortion was really close to graduation. And they were illegal abortions. So I wasn't going to admit I was stupid twice when you could get, a felony against you for it. And that's why.
Well, thank God. Thank God medically everything went well.
So medically, not only did everything go well, but nice as the guy was, I knew I was not going to marry him. The man I married is the perfect man for me. We had 3 wanted children. I would have had a mess of a life. I would not have been ready in any way to raise children. And the children that we've had and raised are proof that my decision was correct.
It's great that you feel that way. So I'm going to ask my last question, but while I'm doing that, I'm going to invite everybody who's watching, if you have a question, throw it into chat now, and we'll follow up with that. And so please feel free to do that now. You just said, and I was anticipating it as I thought about the way I wanted to end my questioning to you, was that writers write to discover themselves, right? To learn something about themselves. But I assume most writers don't write just to learn about themselves. And if you count yourself in that category, meaning that you're writing for readers as well, what would you hope the takeaways would be for readers from this book?
Well, I think all my books, I mean, this is my 12th book, and I think all my books have been written from a personal perspective with an advocacy agenda. Every one of them, even my first, which was a pre-feminist book. And I have to be honest about that. I wrote a book called How to Make It in a Man's World, and I was an ignoramus about women's lives. All I knew was a privileged life because I had a college education. I had a very good career. I ended up vice president of a publishing company. And I wrote about it as if anyone can do this if you'd only try, which is such a familiar conservative message. So I'm not proud of that, but it was a useful book for women of my socioeconomic status. It did go through all the problems career women, rather than just like working women who are the real working women of this world, go through. And it was helpful. So it did have its own agenda. But from that time on, all my books have been, I tell about what happened to me or what I've experienced or what I've seen or what I believe in order to show things are really bad and here's what we can do about it. And then I back it up with data, because anecdotes are not data. So you have to, somebody said that, I didn't. It's a good line, and it's true. You can't just say, my aunt had it, so I know what it's like to have cancer, so you don't know what it's like to have cancer. And so writing this book, I said, I realized that I'm assessing my life because at the time I started, I was 78 and I was facing 80, and I always catastrophized the decade birthdays. I can't believe I'm 30. How did I get to be 40? Oh my God, 50, it's halfway through, and my kids know, and my family knows it. Everybody knows I'm like age obsessed when it comes to the decade birthdays. Someone once gave me a group of my friends gave me the best present. I want to pass it along as a great thing, a great idea. When I turned 40 and I said I was going crazy, I couldn't possibly be 40. Don't trust anyone over 30. And I've already got 10 years on that. People gave me evidence of what you can do after 40. Symphonies that were written, books that were written, movies that were produced. And it was such a life-giving message. So I recommend it. So I'll go back to what I intended with Shonda, because I am trying to keep the through line here. Then I said, okay, I'm facing 80 and I'm realizing I've got all these secrets, and I'm realizing the burden of these secrets and why I kept them and why there shouldn't have had to be secrets. So I need to put it in a context, a framework where people can say, well, I've been through this and that and the other thing, and I hated having to hide it, and it made me feel like crap to have to hide it and all that. So why not make it sort of in the perspective of, you think that's so bad? And that's the title of the last chapter, on which I say, you end up saying what you think was so bad, and the person you're telling it to will say, you think that's bad? They'll tell you something worse. And that's a lesson. Not worse, but something they think is worse. That's the lesson of this book. It's not worth hiding anything. What you think is just the most indefensible, disgusting thing you've ever done is probably going to be bested by somebody you know. So, why not kind of get rid of it? If it's too horrible to ever write down or tell anybody, just get rid of it yourself. Put it in your own, I have a little ash can at the bottom of my screen here. Put it in your own little private computer ash can and know that others have done and had and experienced worse. And, you can do that self-discipline, and the rest of it, just admit, tell your kids. I told my granddaughters about my abortions when my daughters let me do it. I mean, my daughters did not let me tell my granddaughters when I first had sex. It was too soon. So I didn't tell my granddaughters when I first had sex. Why should they, I don't want them to see me as a role model, but not in that. And my daughters,
they gave you some warning, huh?
keep me under control.
That's great. And yeah, go ahead.
I just would say, because I see that there are a lot of people on this, some with whom I know, and, write down your history. even if you're not a writer, and tell the truth. Tell the truth. Because when Molly discovered all the things that I wasn't perfect at, when she read all the stuff and she read my diaries, she read my teenage diaries, and she said, "Grandma, you obsessed over boys." She couldn't believe that her grandma obsessed over boys when I was her age. It's liberating. It's liberating for your kids not to think you were perfect.
That's great. That's great. So yes, there are questions. We don't have a lot of time. I'm going to put a couple of them together, actually. One of the listeners wants to know about your helping launch and being instrumental in Ms. Magazine. Another reflects on your admission of guilt in having to spending time away from your children and the conflict that creates. So I don't know, say about that what you like.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I really put myself through the ringer. I said, what are the things I'm ashamed of? And I was ashamed of some personal things you'll have to read about, because I'm not going into it. It's too deep, too painful. But I did say I was ashamed of two things regarding our children. And that is one, that we allowed our son to go to culinary school instead of four-year college. We did it because we were 1980s parents, and 1980s parents were supposed to respect their children's differences. And our son had been cooking since he was 5 years old. He loved cooking. My daughters paid no attention to me in the kitchen, and my son was shadowing me, teach me how to this, teach me how to that. And he worked at Tavern on the Green, and he in high school. I mean, he was a serious cooker, and we respected it. And we let him go to what was the premier school for training chefs, the Culinary Institute of America, the other CIA. He got into other four-year schools, but they didn't have that program. And we said yes, and we regret it, because when he was in his 30s, he said, I wish I had become a lawyer. I practically slit my wrists because I felt responsible. I felt ashamed that we were trendy enough to go with the flow, instead of saying, what I would have said is, no Jew doesn't go to college. You go to college. That's what I would have said, in all honesty. It's Jewish exceptionalism, but that's what I would have said. I didn't, because I went with the flow of, the new age parenting. The second thing, and to answer your question, the question in the chat, is that I really am ashamed that we didn't give our children more room to say their feelings about us. I think Bert and I, and you know him, you've known him as long as you know me, we felt that we had modeled an equal marriage. We all met at the dinner table at 7 o'clock. We talked about our day. My day was as interesting as his day. They followed his career the way they followed mine. He got up from the table and cleared, and I cooked, he cleared. He fed them in the morning, woke up, because I always wrote late into the night, so I slept. He got them dressed and got them to school. I took care of nighttime, bath times, all of that. We thought we had modeled that, and everything was fine. And it turns out one day in her 20s, one of our daughters said, Mom, there were times when we wish we had more of you. It's a line that, again, I felt like just bloodletting. I said, what do you mean? Oh, well, even because I was at Ms. 3 days a week, and then at home 4, 2 of which Bert was at home, 2 of which I did all the creative, high quality parenting I possibly could. But when I was writing, I put a sign on my door and I said, do not disturb Mom writing. And sometimes when the door was closed, I guess they would have wanted to come in. And I should have said, does this bother you? Is there a better way that we can arrange for you to, come to me if you need me, to interrupt me, feel okay about interrupting me? And I didn't make space for that. And I didn't realize it. And when I said, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you just tell me? And both, because I had convened a family meeting about this. My son didn't feel about it as strongly, but he did recognize the complaint. The two girls were very honest, and they said, Mom, we didn't want you to stop saving the world. We didn't want you to feel guilty. We didn't want to negate everything all the work you had done and make you feel that you made a mistake or that we were cheated. And we felt that if we said something like that, you would get guilty and then you would back off from your work. And we didn't want that to happen. So, your children are kind to you. They're really, your children sacrifice for you as much as you do for them, but I think we don't realize it. They protect us against pain. And it hurts me to think that, it shames me to think that I didn't make room for that. They turned out fine, but still, the hardest thing is what might have been, the stuff you can't correct, the regrets that are permanent. And so I went and put it on the page because I think I'm not alone. Again, my thesis holds. Everybody who reads this book who's a woman asks me about that chapter. Because, we're all guilty about something to do with our child rearing. And some of the men who are smart enough to want to look at their parenting also ask.
Right.
But very often men think, whatever they do is fatherhood. That's fatherhood. I'm a father. I do it this way. That's fatherhood.
Noted. So, I wish there were time for more questions because people do have many. But I promised that this would be an hour program, and I'm going to keep it to that. I just want to say two things before ending. First of all, in one of our study sessions coming up soon, I'm going to bring a text that discusses the question of when you hide and when you reveal. That I think will interest you and will lead to some very interesting conversation straight out of the Talmud and its discussion of Yom Kippur, actually, of all times.
Really. David, could you please send me all these chats because I'm seeing things that relate to Bert. I want to show him.
Yes, for sure. These are recorded, and I will send them to you. But in any case, thank you, Letty, very, very much for your honesty, for your clarity, for your sense of humor in relating all of this. I see you're now looking through the messages, which is great. No, that's fine. You should be. That's great.
Ruth Rosenberg, thank you for this one-liner. She says, I'm a psychiatrist. Hiding from yourself is never good. If you need to hide from others to save yourself, it's different. Thank you for that, Ruth. That is a great one-liner. I wish I could read every one of them to you guys, or maybe you can see them.
They can see them if they want to. They can all be displayed on anyone's screen.
Okay, David, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
And the only thing I would want to add to what's already been said is that if you've read this book, wonderful. I hope that this conversation led to new insights relating to your reading. And if you have not yet read the book, it would be a Shanda if you didn't do so. I'm sure you've heard that line before, but I'm sure others, could not resist. So do you have a preferred bookseller or anywhere people get their books?
Yes, bookshop.com, or maybe it's .org. It's an independent bookstore portal.
Mm-hmm.
Do not make Jeff Bezos any richer.
Great. Okay, so that's super. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. There will be more such talks coming up, sponsored by the Library of JTS this year, so I invite you to join us again. And it's still a few weeks away, but not altogether too early to wish everyone a liberating Passover holiday. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Thank you all.